joining us tonight.
Yeah.
Bit of a chat about what you do. I just wanted to start off with a really basic question, which is what got you interested or inspired to become a scientist?
Oh, a scientist. I think it's probably my love for infectious diseases. And it kind of just, I think it found myself. So I was always really, really interested in infectious diseases and actually vaccines specifically because I grew up in India. I'd seen a lot of infectious diseases. I had a childhood friend who had polio. I'd had family friends die of tuberculosis. So, and it was probably one of the biggest things in India when I was going through in high school, still is. I mean, the pandemics just proved the world wrong in terms of infectious diseases are no longer a problem. And so I really wanted to study infectious diseases, and there were a couple of different pathways to do that. One was, I guess, to study medicine. And then one was to kind of do discovery research. And I think it just found itself to me and opportunities presented. I did my undergraduate degree in India, and then I got offered a scholarship to do my PhD in Australia as an international student at the age of 21. And so I moved here, and probably one of the scariest things I don't think I realized until a couple of years ago how scary that was as a 20-year-old moving here to do my PhD. But yeah, I think it just kind of happened. I don't think I was curious and I was really interested in the field, but I don't think I sat and chose. And I used to have these, I probably still do, images of, I guess, what a certain role looks like or the stuff that I might do as a scientist. And all throughout, I had kind of had that image, and that's probably what got me interested.
That's great. I am jealous that you just knew you had this area.
I don't think I just knew, but I think I've just always followed things as they've happened. Yeah.
Great opportunities. You work in epidemiology and infectious diseases. So is that what you've done your whole way through? What your PhD was on?
No, very different. Some might say that I have a zigzaggy career path. Which I think over time you kind of learn to appreciate. And so I think if there are listeners or others who are interested in science, I don't think people should think that there's a linear way to doing your career. I think it's one of my biggest reflections over the years. So when I first moved to Australia, I did basic sciences. So I'm a lab scientist by training, 10 years, did my PhD in vaccine development for this little bacteria called group A streptococcus, which is essentially what causes sore throat. So many people might have heard about pharyngitis. And it also causes a more severe disease called rheumatic heart disease, which is an autoimmune disease caused by the bacterial infection if it's not treated. And in Australia, it's only in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations. So the rest of the country doesn't have that disease anymore because it's a disease of poverty. So I moved here to do my PhD. And in India and parts of Africa, like in developing countries, it's a highly prevalent infection and disease, rheumatic heart disease itself. So I moved here to do my PhD, working in the lab on designing or doing preclinical and clinical work on this particular vaccine candidate for this disease, and did my PhD on that. Lots of lab work, lots of mouse work, lots of microbiology and immunology, studying cells and immune responses. And then when I finished, I continued to do my postdoctoral training and moved into more tropical infectious diseases and understanding immune responses to them and treatment for that. And then after that, I kind of stumbled upon, I was looking at potential next jobs for me, and I found this really cool job, and I was like, that's what I've always wanted to do. I didn't even know this job existed. And at that time, obviously, I wasn't quite ready for that role, and then I got offered a role in public health, which was essentially on the same vaccine candidate that I did my PhD, but more in a public health capacity. So it was a perfect bridging role of taking me out of the lab, using that knowledge from basic sciences, moving into public health and bringing the two together. And really that's what got me interested in public health. And I did a year of that role and realized I actually needed some formal training and I wanted to learn some skills. And I studied epidemiology after that, and then now kind of use all three of those, immunology, microbiology and epidemiology, together, often in emergency responses or in my everyday work as well. So a little bit zigzag, and went back and did a master's afterwards. So yeah.
Nice. That's this. We have a comment saying that non-traditional career paths can be such an asset for researchers, and as
Absolutely.
you said, you've got a mixed bag of skills to use every day. I guess so. We've been hearing the word epidemiology a lot, given the current climate. What exactly is an epidemiologist?
So an epidemiologist does a lot of different things and lots of cool things. And you can do, you don't have to just do infectious disease epidemiology, and not everything is about outbreaks and pandemics, just if some people are wondering. So in epidemiology, the field of epidemiology is to understand disease patterns and at a population level. Now that can be for things like measles or pertussis or whooping cough or influenza, which are the common things that we often hear about in infectious diseases. COVID-19, as we're seeing, and so the field of dealing with outbreaks is one side of epidemiology, and that's specifically field epidemiology. But it can also relate to things like non-communicable diseases, so looking at risk factors for smoking or looking at risk factors for injury. So it's a wide, very, very big, wide field, but it's essentially the bottom line is that it's really looking at understanding disease patterns and drivers and factors that influence disease patterns at a population level. So the biggest thing is it's looking at numbers at a population level, because what you try and gain is knowledge from a population, as opposed to lab studies where your sample size is restricted by, say, your experiment mouse size or your animal size or your cells or, population clinical trials, number of people you can recruit. This is all about looking at it at a population level, and that's what epidemiology is. An epidemiologist looks at disease patterns, and so that's why you are hearing a lot about COVID-19, is because their main job is to look at disease patterns of how the disease is spreading, what are the factors, what are the drivers, how can we prevent, and based on that knowledge of disease patterns, then you design the interventions for prevention and control.
So you kind of do work, I guess, with both kinds of researchers? Like, do you have interactions, I guess, with those basic scientists that are kind of understanding, I guess, the structures of the infectious disease, and then do you also then work, I guess, with government and such on how to?
Absolutely. And I think my background knowledge definitely helps with being somewhat of a middle person. Not everyone does, but I think COVID-19 is a classic example of why that interaction matters, because we are learning about a new pathogen. So for a lot of diseases, the reason why people don't work together is because we already know that this bacteria does this, and we study the biology of the bacteria. And then those who work in public health and population health work here. But what COVID has done is having to force public health people to talk to the biologists and the immunologists to say, actually, what is this virus? How does it react in your human body? What is it doing? And it's made basic scientists think about, what are the public health implications? Do I really need to study each and every little bit of this virus right now? Or do I need to focus on what's going to really change our ability to respond to the pandemic? So it's brought together light on those things, and I think it really classically shows the value of both those fields, or all of the fields essentially.
So my understanding is you do work on a number of infectious diseases, particularly sort of around that health emergency. I guess, do you want to sort of expand potentially on your work you've done on COVID, or I don't know, your favorite infectious disease, if that?
Happy to. So my main interest a lot is in epidemic-prone diseases, which essentially means that infectious diseases that can lead to outbreaks, because I love, it's kind of fascinating that outbreaks and acute emergencies there's an acute nature of the problem where you design interventions, prevention control measures that have to lead to immediate impact. And there's some diseases that are endemic, so we have them normally in the community, whereas epidemic-prone diseases have a tendency, and there's usually a failure of system that leads to epidemics or outbreaks. So if you see a measles outbreak, it's so complex. So one of the things I work on is vaccine preventable diseases like measles, And so one of the things like in the Pacific I'm working on at the moment is why did we have such a big measles outbreak last year in the Pacific, where Samoa had over 5,000 cases, almost 80 plus children died. Tonga had 700 cases. Why do these countries have measles outbreak? And there are different reasons, especially because measles is an vaccine preventable disease. And then how did it spread so quickly? So what I love about outbreak prone diseases is also how quickly they spread. We don't necessarily wait for months to monitor them. So there's a certain acuteness and an adrenaline that comes with it, how these diseases spread from a person to person. And so, you know, that's one example with measles, with COVID. We've been doing a lot of work around better understanding how COVID spreads between people and what's the best way to collect data on COVID, how it infects healthcare workers. So, and as part of that, of course, right now, a lot of our energy, rather than doing the research, is focused on responding to the outbreak itself. So I was in Papua New Guinea recently with the World Health Organization, where we were responding to the pandemic and really trying to put in, you know, early identification of cases and all those things that in a developed country context is so much more resourced and done better because of the better resourcing. So while we are seeing these big outbreaks, even in Australia, imagine a poor country or a developing country where there are where resources are limited, number of people are limited, everything's a lot more limited. And so over there, training people to respond better, putting in surveillance tools. So how do we monitor diseases? So how do we monitor COVID-19? How do we make sure that we pick up every single case of COVID-19, whether it's through testing, whether it's through reporting at health facilities, training of healthcare workers to essentially, so they wear the correct personal protective gear, so they know how to swab people, so they know how to fill up forms that then tell the health authorities on there's a case of COVID. So it can be really complex things, as looking at how the disease is spreading nationally, putting together, combining the data from all over the country, analyzing the data to see what the trends are looking like. Is there particular areas where we're seeing more transmission? Should the intervention focus in Papua New Guinea, for example, their equivalent of jurisdictions will be provinces. Do we need to focus on certain provinces, or is it a national problem? And so they're looking at data as well as practical operational things as well. And hopefully there'll be, well, not hopefully, for sure, there'll be lots of research opportunities coming along as well, because we need to better understand this disease as well.
It sounds like you're very, very busy. I guess talk back to the, measles and the work around that. So you said you've done a lot of work in the Pacific. I guess what does a day-to-day look like? And same for COVID also. What does a sort of day-to-day activity look like if you are out there in the field? Is there elements of training? Is there collection? Yes.
Yeah, lots of different things. So in Australia, my day-to-day might be sitting on a computer and analyzing data and writing reports and putting in ethics application. And it could be field in Australia or it can be field internationally. A lot of my work is in the Pacific, and that's where I've responded to most emergencies. So in an emergency context, your day could be completely different every day, which is kind of exciting and tiring and exhausting. So long days, but you'll often start with a daily morning update around looking at what your data is showing you. So you might do a daily analysis and daily update and a meeting, and we call it a wrap or a daily operational meeting. You might meet with people, provide updates, and make a daily plan on what the key priorities for the day might be for an outbreak. You review the results. You might sit down with counterpart governments, and you might sit down with national teams to kind of assess the situation, do what we call a risk assessment of what the outbreak is looking like. You might be training people to do interviews and case investigations and contact tracing. Or you might be doing that yourself, going from people door to door from people's house, or you might be going to a healthcare facility to do an assessment on how things are looking and what the needs are and where you can support them. So it can really vary. Some days can be quite analysis and report writing and feeding into other systems, and then someday it can be very hands-on, boots on the ground. We call it going to a healthcare facility or going to a village to do some investigations. So it varies.
it sounds very intense and a lot. And I guess you never know when it's going to happen, right? You don't know when there's going to be an outbreak. You could just be sitting at home, I don't know, having a cup of tea, and then suddenly your whole kind of goes up to respond to
Absolutely. And that makes it exciting at the same time as well. So it takes a certain kind of adaptability, and I think it's a big thing about, but I think that's kind of being a scientist in some ways, is that you have to be adaptable and learning to different settings.
Yes, and adaptable, and I guess, I don't know, would you consider yourself and the work that you have to do and deal with these situations as being creative?
Very creative and very diplomatic.
That's what I like to hear. In your kind of work and the career that you've had, is there a favorite thing that you've kind of done or discovered that you kind of reflect on and be like, that's like a career highlight?
I don't know if I feel like I've achieved anything that is a career highlight yet. I hope there's more to come. But I think my first emergency response in Fiji is definitely close to my heart in a way that some of the work that I did there around, I was there on cyclone response, and that was my first emergency response. And there we did some work around looking at their surveillance system that was implemented post-emergency, and it was a new surveillance system, second time in the world it had been implemented, designed by the World Health Organization. And some of the work, it was a very challenging context because there's a lot of political sensitivities and people are fatigued because responding to an emergency is 20-hour days all the time, especially in resource limited settings where there is no one to give you a weekend break. So you don't have weekend breaks. You don't have somebody to cover up for you on a Saturday or Sunday. So you are working 7 days a week. And we did some assessment of the systems, and that really was taken up amazingly well by the government, and the system still runs in the country 4 years later. Of course, lots of players have come along and lots of actors have come and contributed to make it better. It's changed shape, but it led to some really long-term sustainable solutions in the country, a system that still gets used. There were people hired, public health staff who were hired as part of that response that the report showed had really high value and contribution, who've gone on to do further public health training. So it's been a really rewarding experience to watch, even though my contribution was limited for maybe a year, couple of months in the immediate, but maybe long term. I think what the system does to kind of understand how disease is spread, and is a well-established system in the Pacific for detecting outbreak-prone diseases. So if we start suddenly seeing particular signals of a disease, then we should be able to detect it early. And I do feel proud about that body of work because I think the government really valued it, and we worked in very close partnership with the government where they were completely engaged, and it was a really fantastic, true partnership.
You mentioned there's like sort of key indicators that can sort of arise before you see an outbreak. Are they kind of stock standard, or like, is there, I guess in that feed, is there now, like, I don't know, if 10 people arrive at hospital with a certain thing, does that define an outbreak? Or
yeah, it's a really good question, Maddie. And actually it's not stock standard. It varies for disease to disease. Now, I'll go back to the measles example because I love studying measles. Measles is a classic disease, but we have a vaccine for it, and it's highly effective. And in the Pacific, we have very high rates of vaccination for measles. So when you have a really high background baseline for measles vaccination, immunization, then even one case of, say, for example, anything that presents like measles symptoms. So typically it tends to be acute fever and rash, so sudden onset of fever and a rash, which, you know, you would have heard about the measles rash that you get on your body and on the face. And so I'm not sure what that is.
Like smoke alarm.
Uh-oh.
I think it's just from someone cooking. Yeah.
You need to
like a live
you have to do a live evacuation. And so For something like measles, it might be just one case that would then generate an alert to say something's not right. We need to verify whether this is a real indicator or just a false alarm. It could be because a clinician misdiagnosed, or somebody might be presenting with something that looks like measles-like symptoms, but it's not, which happens a lot. But for other diseases like diarrhea, which can lead to big outbreaks, you always have certain levels of diarrhea in a country. In any setting, you're going to have some people with diarrheal disease of some sort. So for diarrhea, we tend to monitor, have baseline levels, and then only when it goes up a certain threshold in a graph, imagine a graph, and you suddenly see like, okay, it's been bumbling like this for the last couple of weeks, and then you suddenly see a spike. And so that those, we call them thresholds. They're based on basically what is the, to simply put, what is the baseline that you expect in a certain setting for this particular disease. And it would be the same for influenza in Australia. We have systems that monitor how much influenza do we normally get in, say, June of each year, and then suddenly, or maybe April, because that's the start of flu season. So in April, if you start seeing an increase quite early on, then that might be an indicator for a flu outbreak onset before we start seeing, say, more severe forms like mortality or other things. So we do call them early indicators. Doesn't work for all diseases, but there are some diseases that it might work for.
So you're just monitoring data all the time and waiting.
Yeah, lots of data and lots of testing, lots of systems in place to basically understand how, and monitoring populations as well. So often outbreaks will happen. So for example, in a cyclone, the reason outbreaks happen is because populations get moved. So, you know, there's a lot of displacement, water systems break, people lose electricity. So they might go to an evacuation center. And when there's a lot of people coming together, we typically see displaced populations are going to see outbreaks of infectious diseases because lots of people are confined in a small space. So, you know, you also monitor movements of people, because ultimately you're looking at population level data. And so suddenly if you see 100 cases in this particular population, you can't ignore the fact that actually those 100 people might have moved from here to here. So it's a lot about monitoring population movements as well and understanding. And then when it comes to things like certain diseases, say a population might be susceptible to a particular disease because they have under vaccination, or they might have diabetes, which might influence. So for example, COVID, we know hypertension, so blood pressure and diabetes are key risk factors. So if a particular population has high incidence or high levels of diabetes in the population, then that is going to affect how we monitor the disease and what prevention measures we put in place early on as well.
So many variables. Two last questions. One, I guess, as scientists and epidemiologists, what I guess do you hope to achieve in your career? When you kind of hang up your boots and be like, this is me done and out. You can also be never. But I guess what would you like?
I don't know if I'll ever be bored of my work, because I do love what I do. I think, I don't know. I think it would have to be when I feel like, maybe when I've trained enough people. I think one of the biggest things as a scientist you get to do is train the next generation of researchers and scientists. And for me, particularly, on-the-job training in the field is quite rewarding when you do capacity building in another country and you work with teams on the ground in an emergency. It's a very different level of skill. It's not a formal way of teaching. You might do 1 hour of teaching very quickly, and then you might have to work hand in hand to actually implement things on the ground. And that I absolutely love. It is one of my favorite things to do in the field. And so, and how do you teach people under pressure, right? Because those people don't have time to read books and go and practice things. We have to roll with it. And so I think maybe perhaps a time when we start seeing countries be self-sufficient in their ability to respond to emergencies. When we have stronger health systems, evidently we start seeing, you know, immunization, for example, is one of the key health system indicators. We know if a country is well vaccinated, then they have a good universal health coverage program or health system. And so I think that would be a rewarding moment in a particular setting if you saw people were doing, they felt self-sufficient, and we were seeing fewer outbreaks of infectious diseases. So I think it's hard to kind of say at what point you put it off, but I think that would be a pretty rewarding moment to see.
Nice. Wonderful. I hope you can get there.
Well, I hope so too.
I kind of don't wish that there's all these great emergency outbreaks that you need to go to, like, be a part of and train all these people, because we've seen the impact of an emergency outbreak. But also, I do hope that you get to fulfill your career aspirations. So it's a bit bittersweet. The final question is, so where Shirty Science kind of stemmed from in this idea is, and when I know, I guess, the system is working, is that someone walks down the street and stops the person wearing a shirt, and they're like, "Oh, cool shirt," and they're like, "Oh, this is a Shirty Science shirt," and the research is blah. It's Meru from ANU, and she's doing things. What kind of message, I guess, would you kind of want, or what would you want people talking about when they think about, I guess, you and your research?
Two things, I think. How infectious diseases spread from person to person. So essentially that it's a network of people, and a lot happens between people to people, and it's at a community level. And the other one being that it's no one's fault that somebody gets infected or they pass it on to others. So it's kind of like, it's because people come together is what we see infectious diseases. So bugs spread from person to person, in congregation, in groups of people. And I think the other one being that no one is at fault. And it's, I think there are two mechanisms two concepts that are very difficult for people to understand right now in COVID-19. Of course, as an epidemiologist, we do so many things, and I think portraying what epidemiologists do would be really cool. I don't think that's been done. But I think the other thing would be, I think that there would be the three things. The first two come together as one, I guess, is there's such conflicting ideas that people don't quite understand, and we often talk about, there's often a blame that's still being put around this person got infected and they got it from hotel quarantine, or it was because of Ruby Princess. So there's a lot of blame and finger pointing. And I think it's really important to understand for people that, diseases spread from person to person like this, and it's no particular person's fault. I genuinely think people have the best will at heart and no one does it on purpose. And then the other thing might be, what do epidemiologists do in the field? Like, what does it mean to be an epidemiologist and studying population level data?
Which I think we've unpacked a bit tonight. I've definitely learned things. I think you do a very high paced and impactful and meaningful role. And I think, thank you, I guess.
Thank you.
I don't know if anyone watching has any other questions. If so, you can ask them down at the bottom, or I can also pass them on to Meru later on. The next steps from here, I guess, is to take what we've discussed and learned and these ideas of epidemiology and disease spread and transform them into some kind of design. Good luck to all those watching.
I'm excited.
It's the favorite part of what I do, is when emails start flying in or submissions start coming in. I guess you get to see how creative people are and how people interpret certain ideas. The one thing I guess I didn't mention before in terms of design is the way that we print Shirty Science shirts is direct to garment printing. So basically, whatever you can print on with a printer, we can print onto a shirt. So that kind of leaves, there's no color requirements, there's no anything, as long as you can draw it, as long as you can scan it as a high enough quality and send it through. So it means we've got this big, broad opportunity for design. Alrighty, I might leave it there and let you get on with your night, and we'll see what the public comes up with shirt design. Thank you so much for joining and being a part of National Science Week.
Happy National Science Week. Thanks, Madi.
Bye.